The Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines, a story of emancipation, camaraderie, families, bravery, a liberation project ahead of its time, and a story lost to us until very recently. Tonight, Matthew Taylor makes his return to the Napoleonic Wars pod to, frankly, continue rather than finish what we started when we began discussing his work back in December. We discussed the training of this unit, the heartwarming stories of family members going back to plantations to liberate their loved ones, and why white officers were content to look on as these black soldiers conducted raids to spread unrest amongst the enslaved population of the Chesapeake. This is the Black Redcoats at War. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. I actually got to say that for once. Normally I just do the sexy intros. Welcome back, folks, and welcome to the second installment of our deep dive into Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines. We are joined once again by Matthew Taylor, the civil servant in the British House of Lords, who has taken the history world by storm. There, I've said it, so therefore it is unequivocally and uncontestably so, with his new book, Black Redcoats, from Pen and Sword, on the Corps of Colonial Marines. Now, this is the part 2, so you're going to want to scroll back in the catalogue to the Christmas series that we did and listen to the first installment of this series where we lay the groundwork for this. That episode went out on the 28th of December. There you go. I've been very helpful so that you can actually locate it. So if you haven't heard part 1, go and listen to it so that you've got the context for part 2. But Matt absolutely knocked it out of the park with that first installment, so much so that we spent 90 minutes talking and didn't really get through half the questions. So we weren't going to leave it there. Matt, welcome back. Happy New Year. How have you been?
Happy New Year to you. Yeah, I'm doing all right. I fully admit to listening to myself a couple of times and marveling at how limited headway we made into the questions.
This is the thing. If you know what the original question set was, listening to the episodes ends up being quite distressing because you realize that we just don't stick to script. And it does kind of give our guests an intellectual workout that somehow they always just absolutely rise to. It's incredible. Part 1, we discussed the build-up to the formation of the Corps of Colonial Marines, right? Now we need to start telling the actual military story. So let's start with the formation, things like the structure of it, leadership, officers, NCOs, the training. Talk us through the nuts and bolts of how this unit gets created from this group of slaves who have emancipated themselves.
Okay, well, so the British the British fleet rocks into the Chesapeake Bay in 1813. We spend roughly a year reaving and raiding and generally causing trouble in the region, and African Americans come to us and provide all kinds of essential support, guides, information, great granular intelligence, and a fair few of them provide direct military support of their own hands. And the British commanders didn't see this coming, but they recalibrate quite quickly and say we need to take advantage of this. It changes the entire nature of fighting in the United States. It would be fair to say that our initial attacks against the United States in this theater, uninspiring. American War of Independence kind of stuff all over again. Again, we're outmaneuvered by people who know the ground better. We don't have the mass and the numbers, etc., etc. But with these African Americans, that advantage on the American half of now, particularly that of knowledge, local information, intelligence, completely knocked out of the water. well, a quick flurry of, I say quick, this is the era of slow sea communications, but a quick flurry of back and forth communications between the fleet and London take place, and the theatre commanders are essentially retrospectively authorized to turn this unique advantage to 11. Let's see how hard we can do this. That means that on the 18th of May 1814, so in the second year of the war, the British fleet has occupied an island in the state of Virginia called Tangier Island, which is roughly in the center of the Chesapeake Bay. It's far enough away from all the nearby coasts. It's pretty much inviolable. It's got a fresh water source, a decent harbour. The inhabitants of the island are completely pacified, and they're still able to live their daily lives. Some of them even including going back to the mainland, but it's all done by a pass system and things like this. So we've got a solid base of operations. On that island, we build a fortification called Fort Albion, named after HMS Albion, which was the flagship at that point. This island becomes the collection area for escaped African Americans as they come to our various ships. We swing back to Tangier, drop them off there, and we begin a gradual process of, when our military need gives us a reason to send a ship out of Bermuda or send a ship up to Halifax for refit or whatever, numbers of refugees, the black refugees as they became known, they go. But there is a segment of the escapees who don't want to go; they want to fight. And so on the 18th of May 1814, they are massed together. There's only about 40 or so of them at this point, plus some non-combat volunteers. These are all men, of course, and their families. Those who have their families with them are kind of kept with them as well. So in that sense, it's quite an unusual unit in the sense that, formally speaking, the families are always kept with them. It's not like an unofficial thing. The unit is organized like a Royal Marine unit. So we initially start with a single company with these 38 and then 38 or so men, and it expands relatively rapidly from there. They're officered initially by a couple of hand-picked Royal Marines officers from the Royal Marine battalions that are with the fleet. Their training appears to have been a pretty intense, focused, roughly month-long process. You can, looking at all the data, you can roughly say that a Colonial Marine signs up, a month later he sees combat. So in that month, everything is banged into them. From within the Colonial Marines themselves, all the commissioned officers are white Britons, but from within these men themselves, corporals and sergeants are selected, and we can broadly speaking say that these are your most highly motivated men. There's probably ones that had slightly better education, reading and writing, all the usual kind of stuff you need to be an officer. But every single one of the NCO cadre does appear to be quite an admirable soldier. So do them. Yeah, there are quite a fair few of them remain as NCOs the entirety of the unit's existence. Also fair to say, also important to point out, a couple of the privates, the standard Marines, they're in the unit the whole time as well. They stick with it. Having been formed on Tangier, I mean, it's amusing to observe that in that initial couple of weeks after May 1814, news slips out to the United States that we're not only employing for escaped slaves in various unofficial military roles, we've now got an explicit unit of escaped slaves. One American newspaper announces this with the obviously nonsense story that a poor British drill sergeant had to teach a guy which way around to hold a musket, kind of stuff, which is classic kind of classic propagandary nonsense. But having been formed up, they are sent on a whole unit raid onto Pungoteague Creek, which is just a little river off the Chesapeake. A small fortification has been built there by local militia. Little log fort, I think only a single cannon, just enough to prevent you pushing up the creek to communities inland. It is attacked by barge with Royal Marines and the Colonial Marines. It is very quickly overwhelmed, and the Colonial Marines in the after reports, they take a bit of credit for that. They're observed as they inspire shock and awe on the Americans' behalf, but they're more than worthy of that because they are just undaunted by the situation in front of them. They want to take the fight to the Americans. After the fortification is taken and it begins being dismantled by the invading force, whilst the Colonial Marines demonstrate what they bring to the British forces because they immediately move in like a scout skirmish manner into the nearby countryside. So with the kind of confidence that can only come from the kind of people who know this territory. They push out into that, and I feel safe in saying this because it was repeated in numerous kind of memoirs and newspaper reports at the time, with that kind of immediacy that says, that is actually what happened. A colonial marine called Michael Harding, he pushes through some woodland, and there's actually an American militia unit in ambush preparing to catch the British force as they move inland. Classic American War of Independence style situation. Again, I feel comfortable saying this because so many different disparate sources reference it. A Virginia militiaman is so shocked by the appearance of an armed, red-coated black man, he fires early and kills Michael Harding. So Michael Harding is KIA, and he's the first Colonial Marine to die for King and freedom. The ambush, though, is completely blown. The Colonial Marines skirmish with the ambush, pull back to the landing area, and the landing force successfully extracts, having destroyed this fortification. One further Colonial Marine, Kennedy Beaton, was wounded. He goes on to recover, and he serves in the unit for the rest of the war. Well, in the immediate aftermath, the British commanders, who've already observed the bravery and courage of these African Americans in escaping, and their willingness to help and their willingness to take risks to help British forces, they feel completely vindicated in their decision to go formal with this unit. One report says that Michael Harding literally was shot and killed in front of a good number of the unit, and they were undaunted and animated for revenge by his death, rather than suddenly being shocked by the reality of warfare. So, the training they'd been through and the motivation they had together in their very first action is immediately apparent.
Matt, I just want to take you back into you were talking about the way that they were sort of formed, and particularly where their NCOs come from. You say that these the sergeants and corporals are coming. They're black freedmen that have obviously then joined the unit, have been selected by the white British officers. Now, I wonder, my main question surrounding these guys is, do we have any records of their literacy rates? And was there any education? Because, I know in British infantry battalions at the time, I know these are formed around the Marine sort of structure, but in British infantry battalions at the time, you've got regimental schools. And I wonder if the Colonial Marines were provided with any form of education in order to not necessarily advance in the military, but to better themselves in general.
It's a very good question. It's one it's been raised with me before, oddly enough, by a Canadian reenactment group. Genuinely unclear. I personally believe yes, for the simple fact that when we get to the disbandment of the unit, the overwhelming majority of your NCOs, your corporals and sergeants, they go on to be what are variously termed constables or magistrates in the new communities they form. And they're communicating in writing to British colonial authorities, advocating for the people they now have civil authority over. over. Whether they had that before they joined British forces is unclear. In some cases, probably yes. But again, when talking about the levels of literacy required for everyday military kind of stuff, I suspect there was at least some schooling, probably just making use of the battalion of Royal Marines that were present already existing setup. Again, there's enough indications in in kind of the penumbra of the memoirs to suggest that on a day-to-day basis, this unit wasn't segregated from the Royal Marines around them. They operated very tightly and closely, and indeed, as we'll probably get into, eventually the Colonial Marines were folded into a battalion of Royal Marines, so they were separate companies within the same battalion.
Okay, so let's just double back a little bit. So we've talked about their first action, but a key part of why this story is so beautiful, and one of the things that struck me so forcefully the first time I saw you speak, was the bigger emancipation project, almost like the snowball effect that begins to play out as more and more of these guys start to flock to this unit. This kind of sense of, we have this unit here, we have this local knowledge, we could use it to wage a war, or we could use it to do something that seems to fundamentally, and this baffles me because the British government doesn't tend to sort of cave, or British commanders don't generally cave to, well, this is morally right, so therefore we're going to do it. We're going to use this as a reason to go and emancipate these people's families. Now, bear in mind, folks, in terms of the strategic impact of that, yes, there is that impact of depriving more plantation holders of what they would have construed as simply their workforce. But we're talking about families and friends. That therefore inevitably is going to mean, well, look, we've enrolled this soldier, we've got this soldier now, but we're going to get his wife, his children, maybe his parents, and we're going to get them out. And I just want to give you the opportunity to tell that story, because you can do it so much better than I can. And I think it's one of the most eye-opening and one of the most beautiful facets of this story.
Okay, well, the emancipation of escaped African Americans' wider families. So you've got an escapee, he comes to British forces, first it's nearly always he, comes to British forces, and then British forces assist them in a return and a family liberation. That predates the Colonial Marines itself. So for the very first time that happened, I think, just from everything I've been able to find, is on the 30th of May, 1813, two enslaved men, Joshua Cormick and John Silence. They escaped from the plantation they were enslaved on. They came aboard HMS Fantôme under Captain John Lawrence. And something like 2 days after that, at the beginning of June 1813, aided by crew members of Fantôme, these two men, they go back and they come back with their families. And what that suggests about what they were offering to the Brits, what they were asking of the Brits, and what the Brits chose to do with that is, as you say, remarkably intriguing. I feel genuinely that because the British fleet here is engaged in what is essentially a terror campaign, there's no grand strategic, like, capturing territory objective here. This is entirely about putting pressure on the American social and political world to pack in this war. That's all we're trying to do. This liberation of enslaved people becomes it becomes a moral justification, a moral imperative to the British forces because their desperation is obvious again. Lots of British sailors in their memoirs recount with cinematic detail what it was like for overladen canoes of whole groups of people desperately paddling out into the massive Chesapeake Bay in the hope of finding a British ship. The horrible events that happen include, like, a woman came to a landing party from HMS Albion handed over her baby, went back for unclear reasons, never returned to HMS Albion. HMS Albion's Black Cook took that baby, and he actually grew up to be a ship's boy on HMS Albion, who sadly died in an accident on ship in about 1830 when he would have been about 15, 16. So that's an intriguing tale. But once the Colonial Marines are set up, I feel confident in saying that it was understood that if you're going to get nearly always a young man into this unit, you've got to offer the chance to emancipate their wider family. The examples of this include Charles Stewart, Colonial Marine, on the 6th of June 1814. So only a couple of days after the unit is kind of formed. He heads off to. I've actually got it written down. He heads off back to the plantation he escaped from, owned by the Ballards. He liberates his wife Sarah and his kids Juliet, Jane, and Rebecca, and their eldest daughter Becky, and Betty, and her baby Suki. And then he has, and this is recounted in documents provided by the Ballards, he has a confrontation with Elizabeth Ballard, who's like the mistress of the plantation. This confrontation includes a threat to kill her, followed by him kicking in a locked door somewhere in the house and finding his 10-year-old daughter Eliza, who had been locked away in a cupboard by the slave owners to try and keep her. And then on top of that, he also takes away Eve, Mary, and Phyllis, who are all sisters of his wife with their kids. Unbelievably incredible, powerful stuff. So, and there's a British officer there. There's a white British officer there the whole time. He gets an absolute shilling in the American write-ups for letting this to happen. But he sits there, and that's why he's there. He's there to allow it to happen. From there, I mean, it just continues on. There was an enslaved man called Richard Kilgore. Kilgore is a deformation of the name Kilgore. He was enslaved by William Kilgore, who's I think a Maryland slave owner. He has one of my favorite interactions because he escapes along with several others. He comes back weeks later as a Colonial Marine with other British forces, liberates his family, aids British forces in ransacking William's farm, and William is able to have a man-to-man confrontation with him in which he argues, why are you doing this to me? You know, we are this, and in terms of like the real depravities of slavery, this was intensely, incredibly brutal. You know, we are essentially family. As much as I am master and you are slave, this is our life that you and I have built together here, and you're destroying it. And Richard Kilgore, he taps his pocket, and his pocket jangles because he's got some cash in it because he's a paid Royal Marine, and he says, "It's nothing personal, but they're paying me." And then he leaves with his family and loads of other enslaved people. Like, genuinely, like I love talking about it because it's cinematic. It's almost fiction. Now, when I was doing the work on this, there's people I say keep mentioning the film Django Unchained, and people pointed out to me that in reviews of that film when it came out, people said this is a fantasy. This is a fantasy film where an enslaved man gets to get revenge in the personal, meaningful way that only cinema can provide. But no, it happened for real in this conflict. And again, those are only like a small number of them. Talking about families, and I mentioned in episode 1 the intermeshing of enslaved and master families due to all the horrible sexual violence that is endemic in slavery. There was a slave owner called John K. Floyd. I believe he was actually a ferryman. He owned and ran a ferry in the Chesapeake. John K. Floyd came aboard a British ship under flag of truce, and in an attempt to recover a slave of his called Southey. The British on board this ship, there's no Southey on board this ship, but there is a now colonial marine called John Floyd. And thanks to a county clerk who noted down various details of escapees from the county, John Floyd, the colonial marine, was what in the language of the time was called a yellow-skinned black man, which means he's mixed race. So I feel confident, as of others in other works, John Floyd, the colonial marine, was John K. Floyd's son by rape. And he escaped slavery and dumped the diminutive pet-like name Southey and called himself John Floyd. Took his name. And mind-bogglingly beautiful stuff. And again, I mean, I could go on. It just, every single one of these interactions. I'll wrap up with one last one because again, I could go for because it does also give a further indication of how the Brits respond to this stuff. In the near future, during the March on Washington in August, I think it was 1814. William Dare. William Dare is an enslaved man owned by a Dr. Dare of Benedict, Maryland. I think that town's in. He's escaped and he's become a colonial marine. The British force at Benedict is massing in preparation for the march to the Battle of Bladensburg, which leads on to the burning of Washington, D.C. And an American in Benedict, who later provided a written witness statement about this, he saw William Dare be confronted by a white British officer with a, you do not seem to be getting prepared along with everybody else for the march. Get on with it. William Dare reminds the officer, and that's the language the American uses, William Dare reminds the British officer that he's been given leave to exit the march to go to a nearby farm and try and liberate his wife, Nancy. So he drops out of our military operation, our central important military operation, to achieve this with permission. The American's witness statement says the British officer literally said something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, you're that guy. I remember, carry on." William Dare has, again, another deliciously cinematic story. William Dare, he leaves the march and he definitely succeeded in liberating his wife Nancy because William Dare and Nancy Dare, whose surname would be corrupted to Dear, they open a pub in Nova Scotia in 1835, and an American traveller who was also like a travelogue writer bumps into them. And in his book about his travels around Canada in the 1830s, he provides this incredible, beautiful moment of a married couple who are linked by this incredible story of emancipation. He sits there in their pub, and William's making food for him. And this happens a lot in the post-war years. The American says to Nancy, how did you get away? And she says, the second the Brits turned up, I bailed instantly. I got out of there so quick that William had to come after me. And William definitively saved her from slavery. So this American author unknowingly captured an incredibly sweet moment of marital teasing. But then the American continues and says, do you not maybe regret leaving slavery? It's hard up here in Canada. This is a hard scrabble life you've got on the edge of poverty. And Nancy takes him down the garden path. She's like, oh yeah, in Maryland, I was a housemaid and it was pretty dresses and it was easy work. And then she goes, but here in Nova Scotia, I work for myself. At that point, William interrupts the conversation, serves dinner. And everything about their interaction tells reams of powerful emotional story about what this means to people to become their own people and live for themselves.
What you just had there, folks, was the authentic Matt Taylor experience. Just incredible history, very carefully researched, and presented with genuine feeling and emotion. And this is precisely why I was so adamant after about 10 minutes of your talk that I saw last year that you were coming on to do one of these episodes. It becomes all the more emotive and moving because of the way that you tell it. And if that's not an advert to go and buy the book, then frankly, folks, I don't know what is. But I do want to dig into some of the history behind it. I mean, the agency behind these stories is just mind blowing. And the immediacy with which that agency is seized upon is something that I find very striking. This is risking becoming more of a point and a comment than a question, which is something that I do desperately hate whenever people inflict it upon us at conferences. But it does, to me, offer admittedly sort of tangential, sort of circumstantial support, but support nonetheless to the idea that forms of resistance were baked into the everyday thinking and the everyday reality of slaves' life. And the key becomes them having the opportunity to seize upon those opportunities. The it, what am I trying to say here? I suppose firstly, do you agree with that? You know, is that pie in the sky?
Right?
But is there sort of something to suggest that really there's quite a lot of resistance, or at least perhaps discussion of resistance going on behind the scenes that of course we can never know because there are no records to support this in reams of detail to look at it sort of ultra analytically. But the fact that there is almost this sort of click of a fingers, right, we're doing this, and these plans are in place, sort of suggests a conversation has gone on well prior to these opportunities being seized.
I would say yes. I would say there is no such thing as a contented slave in any circumstance. There is levels of comfort, there is levels of security, but there is never contentment in the truest sense. And slave uprisings and slave rebellions across all slave societies worldwide, but we're talking primarily about the United States and, say, the British Caribbean here, it's always noted with comfort by slave owners that that uprising didn't go crazy though. It didn't, it wasn't everybody. It was just a hardcore. But the problem with that analysis isn't, if you're sat there in the middle of that chaos and you're an enslaved person, it's like any revolution. Can you see the end of the revolution where all the authorities you've literally just angered don't come back and immediately reinforce their control? And inevitably, in the nature of slave societies, it'll be brutal. It'll be brutal. It'll be exemplary. It'll be horrifying. Haiti is the best example of this. There was a point in the Haitian Revolution where a critical mass was reached, and everyone said, "This could work, so we've got to get behind it." In more or less every other slave rebellion throughout North American and Caribbean history, that point was never reached. It was always a conflagration in a limited area by a limited number of people. What's the end game? What's going to be the post this violence moment when we're free? How are we going? Who will recognize us? Why have the authorities we've kicked away have any reason to respect or recognize us? In this scenario, the War of 1812 scenario, African Americans know that there is a big war happening between two marginally different tribes of white people. So go with the one offering freedom, because they've got the capacity and the ability to actually make it happen. So you've just got to finally get out the door in the night, as you've probably always wanted to. But again, there are, again, in American history, I can point to a couple of little things. There's the Great Dismal Swamp, which is, I think, in South Virginia. There's this huge swamp area. A tiny community of escaped enslaved people made its home there for potentially centuries, but it couldn't support huge numbers. The German Coast Uprising in 1811, which was one of the most violent in Louisiana history. I think some analysis is like 75% of the enslaved people, even after white families evacuated the area ahead of the uprising, 75% of slave people more or less stayed at home. They sat and waited to see how it was going to play out. Those and the people who rose up in that uprising were subject to an exemplary punishment. They had their heads put on stakes all through the region to show what happens to slaves who rebel. After Buss's rebellion, British forces did the same on Barbados. The heads of various people were put all over the island. Classic medieval, hanging, quarter and draw them and spread around the kingdom. That's the norm for a slave uprising. But if it reaches this special critical mass, this extra level, and people can see that freedom is right there for them if they will only grasp it, people do. And that's it. I would argue from that. Yeah, it never goes away. And it's meaningless to suggest you could somehow terrorize, beat, or even breed, as some people thought, breed this desire out of people. We all wake up every day in our circumstances and imagine how we might be able to change them if things were slightly different. Enslaved people do every day too.
Sorry, I want to actually bring you into the conversation at this point, Liam, which I know is unusual, given that I do love to hog the mic and inflict the sound of my voice on our listeners. Because what I'm thinking about, perhaps inevitably, when we're talking about violence and the use of fear, is the conversations that we have around discipline. Now, yes, I'm very sorry, folks. Stop chuckling to yourself, Liam. But you obviously have heard far too much about my views on discipline, but there is always this core that if you're going to just brutalize people, there will come a point where they will turn around and bite you in the arse. Obviously, I mean that metaphorically. And within this entire sort of structure of slavery must have been a two-way fear system, not a one-way fear system, because yes, quite obviously, and you've demonstrated this point very clearly, there is a huge fear that, well, look, if we take the wrong side, it's going to be heads and spikes and reprisals for our loved ones. And horrific as life is right now, do you particularly want to be somebody who either ends up with your head on a spike or worse still, you live just long enough to see your family subjected to that treatment? So there is the fear in one direction, but in the opposite direction, people understand the idea that if you brutalize people unrelentingly, it fosters resentment. And so I'm convinced, and again, please tell me if I'm wrong. And Liam, think about the military perspective. You understand this. Like, surely it's the same mentality. Like, they must know that this is going to end badly, and they must fear the prospect. The white sort of plantation class, the white settler class, however you want to describe that. Obviously, the correct terminology differs depending slightly on which nation we're talking about. That must have been known.
Oh, I definitely say it. I would point to Alan Taylor's excellent book, The Internal Enemy, which focuses primarily on the state of Virginia. But it basically says that it's like I've said in episode 1, a precarious security society, a society continually trapped in a cycle of authoritarian brutalism, but never knowing if it's enough to stop people desiring to resist, desiring to get revenge. A good idiomatic example of this is throughout 19th century American writing, you can often find references to "I hear the fire bell," and the fire bell is a classic kind of plantation idea. There's a fire in the barn, there's a bell to ring it. That fire bell isn't just the fire bell; it's the slave uprising bell. It's idiomatic in the culture. You also have the excellent kind of the excellent and kind of very illustrative line: a universal conflagration. We are always in fear of a universal conflagration. say various Americans from slave states. And what they mean is we are always in fear of, which in one much more on the nose example, we are always in fear of the savage Negro War, which is what they're imagining they're holding down every day, but also I think intrinsically are aware they're creating the circumstances that make such a war savage and brutal every day as well, if it ever was to happen, if you see what I mean. Yes, I think again it's more these reasons I would argue this kind of societal setup is essentially inherently unstable in an incredibly obvious way. You can't just to give a very sudden, precise and kind of this is going to really be horrifying for everyone who doesn't know where. There was an organization in American history that started roughly in this period, just after this war, called the American Colonization Society, which was a very peculiar organization in that it had both pro-slavery and anti-slavery people in it. And it was based around the idea that you should move African people back to Africa. It's the reason the nation Liberia exists. Liberia is the American Colonization Society's project. The American Colonization Society never got massive traction because it was based on the inherently racist idea there's no place for black people in the United States. And in the early years in particular, it had a very overt focus on getting free black people to leave America, but keep the slaves, because the slaves have an economic role that is locked in. But the ideas entertained by the American Colonization Society included at one point the forced mass kidnapping of all black children at certain times of year so that the slave population would never outgrow the white population. This is just, it's so baked in. Another kind of example, I don't think they ever built it, but at one point Virginia considered building a heliograph tower system like France has. And it had pre-existing symbols for, enemy approaching, British, French, Spanish, and Negro built into the code system. Didn't even have to spell it out. There was a flag, so everyone knew there was a rebellion. Yeah, so it's heavy stuff.
It's incredibly powerful. I mean, it's shockingly powerful, and I think, you tell it in such a way that it brings so much life to it. That I don't know. I'm almost lost for words. I think in terms of that utter savagery, it's cyclical, isn't it? We must oppress to suppress rebellion, but the fear of rebellion will never go away. So we get just unspeakable punishment against these people because the fear always cycles. And it never goes away. It will never go away, because I think ultimately, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm looking at it through a modern bias. You cannot be, as a species, we are not meant to live that way. We're not constructed to live that way, whereby we hold people in bondage in dire conditions. So the fear is almost an admission of guilt.
I would definitely agree. I mean, yeah, I can link this in what some might see as a quite incendiary way. I don't mean it. I'm a person who only seems to deal with this type of history. I always remember that part of the reason Nazi Germany moved to gas chambers was because they were concerned about the mental health toll of murdering lots of people with gunshots on their soldiers. It was easier to lock people in a room with a chemical. People didn't have to see it. People didn't have to feel that they'd done it. And that, I think, as you say, that says intrinsically people know that, you know it's wrong. That's it. But again, going back to episode 1, when I talked about, Jefferson, who was an abuser of the slave system and a participant and a profiter of it, yet he he sat and he looked inside himself and he put down on paper how wrong it was, even as he participated in it. And then again, linking it back to what I mentioned before, is like anything which claims intrinsic superiority of one person above another has automatically failed by providing a get out clause for your humanity for the person who's superior. If I'm superior, I can do no wrong in this regard. It releases you from your common humanity and common morality. And therefore, and again, societies can't operate that way, if you see what I mean, you know.
I'm not about to take a Nigel Big R style twist on this interview. For those of you who aren't familiar, Nigel Big R was a guy who basically wrote a book following a very inflammatory article in which he sought to defend on moralistic grounds colonialism as a concept and as a project, which I have profound trouble with for many reasons that we won't go into here. So my intent here is not to sort of try and apply that lens to how we're looking at this, but I was very struck by one of the things that you said earlier in relation to white officers overseeing all of this, because we know plenty about the white officer class. And I'm not about to sort of indulge in the Sharp-esque tropes of sort of your Colonel Simmersons and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, there is a very substantial proportion of the British officer class that has a degree of wealth. Now, a proportion of those people will have their wealth as a result of plantations. Their families' estates will be in the Caribbean. So you have a strata of society that has prominent individuals in it who are invested in slavery as a means of making money. And yet you have individuals from that same strata who are presiding over exactly what you've described, doors being kicked in. Where the hell is my daughter? We are getting out of here. If you don't tell me where my daughter is, I am going to stick this bayonet through you, kind of thing. Now, it's not much of an imagination. You don't need much of imagination to envisage that being really quite unsettling for white officers of not even a conservative outlook, but just an outlook that is frankly typical of this period. And I'm trying to work out how the two coexist. And perhaps more particularly within the case of the Colonial Marines, how somebody somewhere managed to make sure that the right kinds of officers were in command of this unit so that you didn't have that massive conflict in terms of how they sought to police their men fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a good question. How it happened, massively unclear. I can make some. This is wild speculation time. Admiral Coburn, who was the kind of the on-site commander, the theatre commander was Cochrane by this point. Admiral Coburn, he was one of the many kind of people who orbited Nelson a decade before. He now himself had created his own like cadre of fellow officers around him who he was promoting and supporting through their careers. And I think, again, I don't know this in enough detail at this time to say this definitively. I think he himself had, I can tell you that he literally at one point wrote a letter saying, I was initially concerned about the raising of black troops because I was not entirely convinced that black people could be effective soldiers. But I have revised my opinion of their entire race based on the support of these men and how good they are. There's also an interesting note that in the entire War of 1812, Admiral Coburn refers to one man as his friend who isn't an officer, and it is a Colonial Marines NCO called Sergeant Johnson, who I'll talk about later. Coburn has this cadre of officers, junior officers around him who are commanding all the other ships in the flotilla. I think he initially set that standard. I can point to various officers. I say, I've got what's the word? We've got John Lawrence on Phantom, and Captain News or Nous, who delights in asking Americans who started the war when people are shouting at him about their houses being ransacked by black people. He's like, oh, who started this war? He also is a frequent user of a line that became, in my opinion, kind of the slogan for the British officers leading these various attacks, which is, "They're as free as you are." Over and over again, across multiple officers, multiple ships, multiple interactions with American civilians, particularly slave owners. So they point to the emancipated African Americans and they say, "They're as free as you are. Mind your manners." And how that interacts with the hypocrisy of Britain's ongoing slave empire at its time, I would argue this might perhaps be an indication that, and this prepare yourself, because this is opening a real box that I love talking about. I'm a big believer in the idea that history is a series of accidents and we add a story to it later. In terms of British history, the abolitionist movement in Britain was kind of the high watermark of the idea of a Christian moral gentility amongst gentlemen, which means that you're not only a superior type of person because of wealth or prestige or privilege, it's also a moral imperative that is part of your religion. That cultural movement hit an apex and got us the abolition of slavery. In my opinion, again, this is me just being hyperbolic and fun, like what feels like a weekend before scientific racism arrived to justify the Darwinian separation of the different races of man and eugenics and all that nonsense which came after it. Purely by accident, British culture had this moment where to be a good person was to be a very humane person, very couched within the terms of Protestant Christianity at this time. And that slammed into our political and social systems just in time. Not only, again, this is another whole shtick. Everyone talks about slavery in isolation. Slavery was abolished within 2 years of the first introduction of actually enforced working rules for the white working class here in Britain, and within years of the Great Reform Acts, which turned a pre-modern aristocratic oligarchy into a representative democracy, albeit with a limited franchise. There was this great bow wave of reform at the beginning of the 19th century, just before the Victorian age arrives, where everything about British society is 1960s level redefined. And then the Victorians arrive and say it was always like that, and it's all black and white, and and we forget that this incredible, beautiful, like snowflake moment when it all came together didn't have to happen that way. Say, give it another year, give it another year, another 18 months. The slave owners in the House of Commons could have organised themselves a little bit better and arranged a West India, instead of being the West Indies lobby, they could have been the West Indies party. The elections in this country could have been decided by people deciding what side of the divide they're on. It never really came up. It was sometimes used as attack against candidates in elections in this country, but it was never like a major thing. But if they'd poured the money into political campaigning, as opposed to just kind of attempting to buy off the top people, could have changed everything. Could have been a dividing line in our society here on the home island, which it never had the chance to. Even at this point in the 1810s, it was already quite embarrassing in a way that slavery existed. Slave owners British slave owners were nearly always absentee slave owners. There was very few who lived in the Caribbean with their slave. Most of them were at cocktail parties in London, dodging how they get their money. Everybody would hang in there in the Caribbean slave economy until they had enough money to cash out of that, buy a nice house somewhere in Buckinghamshire, and then put their money into annuities and mortgages and stuff you can actually talk about in polite company, if you see what I mean. And that, again, that has intriguing negative effects as well, because the lack of a long-term kind of planter class in the Caribbean is part of the reason the Caribbean is underdeveloped, because it never needed to develop to support the master class because they weren't there. It just had to be. It was just as I said before in episode 1. It was just a gulag. It was just a production site. If you see what I mean. So it has both negative and positive effect. But as I say, in terms of wider British history, this island and our culture, what I would, white British culture, which is which is broadly speaking the underpinning of all British culture, we got so incredibly lucky that in the 1830s it all came together. This bow wave of gentility and morality smashed into the realities of an emerging modern industrialized world, and we cleared that by say accident of history. We cleared it by luck alone, and didn't get ourselves locked into another 50 years of slavery.
You can probably hear a little scratching noise and a little squeak going on in the background as we're recording this, folks. That is the sound of my brain working overtime, because I spend a lot of time thinking about humanitarianism and the existence of it, the lack of it, quite where it sits. I've inflicted this kind of thing on folks before when talking about crime and punishment, and particularly corporal punishment, and the lack of interest in abolishing flogging as a punishment. Even, great humanitarians of the age like William Wilberforce turning around and using arguments that often get fired at him, quite frankly, when he's trying to campaign on the issue of abolition, because he turns around and says, look, now's not the moment. It's not practical to do this right now. And so I often take the stance that, yeah, there is something going on in terms of humanitarianism. Don't get me wrong. Of course there is. But at the same time, it has its limitations.
Matt, I just want to bring back the Colonial Marines into this huge, we've gone pretty deep. And I'm conscious of the fact that obviously they escape enslavement. They, in some cases, liberate their families, and they serve the British. And we've talked about the sort of officers and the officer class within the British Empire. But how much, if any, evidence do we have of the hypocrisy of these guys that know they're serving the British when 1,000 miles away in the Caribbean, other enslaved people are suffering just as brutally as they were? I mean, is it a case of, me, I've got to look after me and mine, and I get that, some of these guys have got wives, got children, got families. Is there any evidence of not resistance by the Colonial Marines as such, but as comments at least on the situation within the situation of slavery within the British Caribbean?
I have very limited to work with there, but I have two things that I think can tell us a lot. The first is that in American newspapers, almost instantly, the propaganda becomes that all these people the Brits are arming and using against us, they're all dumping them straight into plantations in Jamaica the second they're no longer militarily useful. And that becomes frequently referenced enough to think that that almost certainly made its way into the African American community's understanding of the world. The world. That, there's at least this story going around that we're dragging, we're exploiting you as much as anybody else, and the future is actually just slavery just in the British Empire. And the fact that the Americans go to that extent, I think, indicates possibly a fear of whether we're actually offering freedom, and also perhaps and something happens later which indicates this, and perhaps also this is how they would handle it kind of situation. That a contractual relationship between a white man and a black man is meaningless. The other major observation is that eventually a West Indies regiment officer arrives on Tangier Island. The original kind of written plan, was that these men wouldn't be Marines. They would be put into the existing black regiments of the British Army, which means the West Indies regiments. My personal belief is that the Royal Navy commanders ignored that. Oh, the West Indies guy hasn't turned up yet. Good. Let's put them in the Royal Marines, because then we're actually increasing our own striking power, increasing the weight of the Royal Navy's capacity in landing operations, giving the Royal Navy commanders more fingertip control of what's happening. They'll when the army arrives, they'll have essentially a bigger hand to play in discussions about plans, because we're contributing proportionally more troops. But when the West Indies officers arrive, only a tiny number of African Americans join the West Indies regiments throughout the entire war, despite the ongoing offer at all times. And I personally believe that is because the African Americans were probably aware that that kind of regiment, the pre-existing, was essentially it was an internal security force for slave colonies. The West Indies Regiment very frequently put down slave rebellions. There's there's a particularly heartrending recollection of how I think it was again Buss's rebellion on Barbados, a crowd of uprising slaves saw the thin red line in front of them was all black men, and they cheered before the West Indies Regiment shot them down. Timothy Lockley has a great work on this in the Society for Army Historical Research about why the West Indies regiments felt they were different from other black people. As like I talked about in part one, the idea of a expansive black identity, I think isn't actually helpful here. There was differentiation, but also, as I'm sure you guys are aware, the West Indies Regiment before 1808 was filled by the British Army secretly purchasing slaves, like more or less off the boat, and putting them straight into the West Indies Regiment to fill out the numbers. It was, again, if you want a really incendiary point, the largest single institutional owner of slaves in British history was the British Army, because it purchased 13,000 people over, I think, 2 decades. None of those 13,000 people were ever sold on, and all of them who left service became free. So there's a happy end to that. But the British Army in the Caribbean, it even covered it up. They did all the slave purchases via the Army Extraordinaries system, which wasn't like well audited or you didn't have to report too hard on. So people in London couldn't find out. The abolitionists couldn't come at you. In 1813-14. It's only 5 or 6 years after the formal end of the purchase of enslaved people for the West Indies regiments. Some of the men in the regiment were probably bought men. They'd been bought and made into soldiers. And I imagine if any of them had any encounters with the Colonial Marines, and there was definitely a fair few encounters between the two regiments later in the war, I think that would have said the Colonial Marines, no, we are a separate group. Us African Americans, we are a separate group, and we've got our own contractual relationship with the British state, and we need to look after ourselves. And again, I would argue that's what happened. The cohesiveness of the Black refugee community in other parts of the Caribbean and in Canada after the war is very clear. They see themselves as one group moving out into the world. They don't necessarily feel direct connections with anyone else around them. They've grabbed their freedom, and they're going to maintain it for themselves.
For folks who are interested in following up on that tip off there from Matt, Tim Lockley has written a book. It's now available in paperback from, I believe, Cambridge University Press. And of course, because it's in paperback, it's now very affordable at sort of 25 quid a pop. It's called Military Medicine and the Making of Race. And we also interviewed Tim a long time back in relation to, funnily enough, the War of 1812, for what was then styled War of 1812 month, where we talked in depth about the West India regiments. So I can recommend that to folks, both of those to folks if they are interested. Matt, we got as far as question 3, which admittedly, like it's not a ringing endorsement for us telling concise stories on this show, but it is a testament to just how fascinating it is to sit down and talk with you. We are not done. there will now be an installment number 3, which will predominantly focus on so I was kind of thinking, well, look, at least we'll cover the combat today. Well, we haven't. We started the combat, at least, folks. So we will finish off the combat story, and then we will talk about legacies in much more detail. So I look forward to welcoming you back for that. Folks, Black Redcoats was published by Pen and Sword. Go direct to their website. It costs, I think it's £25. I may be wrong. I'm getting a nod. That means yes, it is. It's £25. And then you can get the full story in all of its splendor for yourself. We will, of course, help you in that process because we will put a link to the book in the description to this episode so that all you've got to do is scroll down and click said link. Matt, ever a joy to speak to you. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And I can't wait to have you back very soon.
Looking forward to it.
This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will return very soon. Folks, do me a favor. Go and review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment, crucially. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the most powerful thing you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people subscriptions to the Patreon perks we offer? So, if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, book clubs, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much, much more. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month. So if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-January 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, Daniel Friedman, and Jonathan Willets. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.